Hello, it's Scott Manley here with episode 81 of the Interstellar Quest, and we finally have our moon ferry on course for the moon, headed into orbit and finally to the landing site, the mysterious landing site where we have discovered Sean Kerman hiding out in a disabled spacecraft not of my design. The moon ferry is of course not the first attempt to recover him, but it is the first with a tried and tested vehicle, a vertical takeoff capability, nuclear powered by antimatter-induced nuclear fusion, and a super high-tech Methalox-fueled thermal turbojet, which also turns into a thermal rocket as well, which means we can bring it all the way into space without changing things. Isn't Interstellar mod great? It's just a shame that the developer Fractal UK has kind of disappeared, and the official update to support 0.24 never really happened. Instead, another developer has come along to support Interstellar mod and make sure that it works. However, he has decided to go for the game balance approach rather than realism, which may actually make it better for some people, but makes it completely incompatible with this series. So that'll be another reason why I can never upgrade this saved game. Anyway, we've found our landing site, and we're going to try and put this spacecraft expertly down within a few meters, with as few meters as possible, let's say. Obviously, there's a limit to how close I can get because I have these giant radiators sticking out the side here. We need to get close enough that we can transfer fuel and everything as well. It's important that we get close enough to the outland so that we can run a pipe between them and service its life support system, bring back some food, add some new snacks to the cupboards, and of course pump out its septic system. It's of course incredibly important that I don't mess up those two connections. Anyway, I'm trying to make this approach here, and you see what I'm trying to do is on the nav ball, I'm trying to make sure that both the velocity vector and the position vector of the target are more or less kept coincident. So this is like a powered descent slope towards this target. And we're about to pass 2 kilometers, 2.5, and there we go, we get a bit of a loading glitch there. You can see this is obviously all in time acceleration mode. Now the other thing to look at is on the left next to the nav ball, the throttle is running at very, very low levels here. Because this is the Methalox fueled engine, it has much higher thrust compared to, say, liquid fuel or liquid fuel oxidizer. That's the way it's balanced in Interstellar mod. So anyway, I'm just about to come down here, and that will actually turn out to be incredibly important to to old me, as I attempt to put this spacecraft down within as few meters as possible. So over to old me. Landing on the moon is easy. Landing within a few meters of your target, that requires a little bit of patience. Come on, okay, throttle, and excellent. No, come back. Okay, there we go again. That was actually kind of hard. Okay, so one of the problems is I'm requiring huge amounts of thrust here. The other problem is that I have very little rotational control here because the reaction control thrusters are air-based. Okay, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust my thrust limiter to about 20%. So I should have more control here over this. Very useful trick if you're trying to land on the moon and you find that that if you overthrust too easily, you basically find yourself yo-yoing up and down. You can cut the thrust limiter to make sure that you have much more thrust control. Of course, that does mean that you reduce the lag, or you reduce the responsiveness because you have to move it over a further distance. But I'm sure you guys can compensate. It's very, very good idea to adjust these things. And I am adjusting my approach very, 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 very carefully. Instead of yo-yoing up and down now, I'm still yo-yoing from left to right as I'm trying to put that little patch of shade as close as possible, and just down there. Will that be close enough? I'm not sure that will be close enough for the pipe, but I guess the best way is to actually jump out and find out. Okay, set my thrust limiter back to normal, because before I forget, it would be unfortunate to be descending through the atmosphere at the speed of sound and then realise that, or forget about this. And now Sidney Kerman gets to do his best impersonation of a septic service technician. Grabbing a pipe, running it all the way over and making sure he sticks it in the right port. There we go. Now linking, we got to run all the way back with this giant green pipe hanging behind us. And then, of course, I could make reference to that urban myth about the person who tried to siphon fuel out of an RV and instead ended up siphoning stuff out of the septic tank instead. Obviously, the victim in the myth should have used Thunder Aerospace Corporation's fuel balancer mod to make sure the stuff was pumped correctly. Meanwhile, after being on the moon for months, Sean Kerman finally gets to leave. He packs up his stuff, including his imaginary friend Wilson. He takes the opportunity to pose for a photo one last time. If it wasn't for the fact that this is a classified site, he would probably use it as a postcard. But most importantly, now that he has had supplies returned, he has a new supply of flags. So he can ascend to the top of this monument that stands out above the moon, and he can finally put his mission flag on top. Of course, he needs to get some souvenirs first to bring back home. The ground apparently is made of awesome stuff. Planting the flag, trying to think of an appropriate quote. Sean was here for a really long time. While he's happy to be going, I'm sure he feels that he might miss this place and want to return. After all, he has spent a great deal of time here, getting familiar with the various nooks and crannies and hills and other features in the area. He has named them all, and will unfortunately go home to find out that some scientists back home have come up with their own names and he'll have to fight them for them. And now with all the science packed up, it's time to head home. Throttle up to 100%, head westward. And then at this point, somehow the file got corrupted, so I get all the way home relatively quickly. But yeah, I'm sure you know how that all went. So yeah, we put ourselves into a low 100-kilometer orbit, and then the idea was I created this skimming trajectory. And then as I came over it, I just burned all my fuel to create a very steep descent. The idea is that a steep descent lets you actually target the location a little more easily. If you're doing a shallow descent, then you'll spend a lot more time in the atmosphere slowing you down, which means your landing site will actually move a lot more, so it's much harder to actually get where you want to go. Anyway, as we descend through the atmosphere, it's over to old me to make sure we make final terminal guidance corrections here. Okay, so we're aiming for the west side of the mountains. Let's check the map, and that is looking good. Time to deploy the air brakes, I think, to get my... Oh! No! 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 Oh no! That was the wrong button for the air brakes. Air brakes is 3, not 2. That is terrible. It looks like I've lost my cooling system, and I've also lost a fuel tank there on the side, so it should be unbalanced. I'm just wondering whether the reactor will go into thermal shutdown because there's no radiators now. Well, old me was quite right to be concerned about this, but of course we have a re-entry heating to go through first, and we want to make sure that we slow ourselves down pretty quickly here. So we wait until we're over the mountains, and then we start firing the engine to slow ourselves down. Now it turns out that having the engine firing, that does actually get rid of most of the waste heat,
because the heat is essentially being exhausted by running an atmosphere over it. So there is a cooling system built into the thermal turbojets. You'll find that you can't even fire up some reactors when you have no radiators on your ship. Anyway, getting to the base, or getting back to Kerbal Space Center, requires a little bit of finesse here, and includes the occasional flip as the thing becomes aerodynamic. The aero brakes are designed to make it stable in one direction or stable in reverse. And they mostly work, but they also make it very hard to actually go sideways. But of course, we finally get down and land... there. Yes, we land there. Old me doesn't even need to get involved here. But there we are. Sean has returned from the moon with... Upon debriefing, he is horrified to find out that not only was he replaced by Lambert Kerman, but that nobody noticed, and they let him fly off to Duna as part of a cutting-edge exploration mission. He insists that he looks nothing like Lambert Kerman. Speaking of him, out in deep space, the Duna Express is making some final course corrections to bring it close to Kerbal for capture and braking. It's only a minor tweak to the trajectory, but it's important to get it right because the 100 kilometers difference in your final position is the difference between flying past the planet and crashing into it. Real interplanetary missions, of course, have these kind of trajectory changes too. I mean, they can calculate perfect orbits and perfect burn times, but the valves on the rockets to cut off the fuel can't close fast enough to get exactly the right time. Anyway, in preparation for the return of, well, possibly the hero and possibly the traitor, we need to have a quarantine facility set up at Space Lab 1. So we actually resurrect the good old-fashioned Tundaz spaceplane, and it still performs exceptionally well. It's just we had one of those sitting around. The Ramius 3 actually has a slightly larger cargo bay, but this one is easier for me to fit the 2.5 meter parts into. Anyway, after 20 minutes and still on a suborbital trajectory, we come into an encounter with the Space Lab 1. So the first thing we need to do is fire our engines along our orbit to make sure that we get into orbit, and again I just follow the standard technique of burning and pushing my retrograde or my approach vector right onto the target so we come down and fly past it. Moving at 54 meters per second, we will fly past the target relatively quickly, and then some final last minute corrections using, of course, the Sabre engines will put us within a few hundred meters of the space lab, so we can drop off the cargo and then, well, get out of here, really. There we go. 100 meters away. Let's kill my velocity. There we go. Drop the velocity using the RCS thrusters. Bring those down to just about there. Now, time to ditch this thing and attach it to the lab. So it's totally autonomous. We're not dealing with robot arms or anything here. The nice robot arms would be a nice thing to have, but the problem with them generally is that when you're using like the space shuttle robot arm or something, then there's somebody actually sitting at the shuttle controls, controlling the thing and holding position. We have SAS, which will hold position, it'll hold like rotation, but it will sometimes induce translations because the RCS thrusters aren't perfectly balanced. So it'd be nice to have a mode or an autopilot that basically tries to hold translation position relative to a target while I muck around with the robot arm and try to attach pieces. Instead, I pretty much put a probe core, RCS thrusters and fuel on every single part so that we can actually dock it to the station in question. There we go. You see it's got a lab, it's got a hab module, and it's got a door that locks. That's the most important part. We don't want any of those important scary things getting through into the space station. The KSC administrators aren't entirely sure whether to believe Sean's crazy story, but at the same time they think that quarantine on returning from Duna would be a prudent measure. Frank and Dildred Kerman are at this time receiving important lessons on running a quarantine facility or a prison. Meanwhile, the Dundas is returning to Kerbal and we perform a standard deorbit burn. It turns out that we were really close to the space center, so I wanted to try a crash re-entry in this thing. Now, if you remember, this was with this spacecraft, it was possible to pump all the fuel backwards and make the thing aerodynamically unstable, right? And by default, in fact, all the fuel goes backwards. So even though I'm coming into the atmosphere at an incredibly steep angle, I should be able to ride out the re-entry by increasing my surface to area, by increasing the angle of attack, such that we decelerate rapidly and, of course, slow ourselves down before we hit the lower atmosphere. We actually fly over the space center at about 50 kilometers in a maximal angle of attack situation. You can see the G meter rising about 2 Gs, and then it basically pitches nose down. But good news is that even with the help of RCS, we are able to keep the nose high and arrest the vertical speed. So even with the steep ascent, we're able to bring it under control, and yet we still get this unbalanced, we still get this belly flop attitude every now and again. And with a bit of work, we transfer the fuel forward, and now we have an actual flying machine that will be able to bring us back to base. We're probably about 150 kilometers out, but at least we didn't have to make an extra orbit. I have to say, I really have found flying the aircraft to be much more enjoyable with Ferrum Aerospace installed, because the aircraft have so many failure modes that it's forever a mystery wondering why it doesn't fly correctly or why the wings fall off, for example. Well, pretty sure I know why the wings fall off. I know a lot of people stay away from Ferrum Aerospace because it makes wings fall off, but you can go into the debug menu, or the Ferrum's debug menu on the title screen or in the Space Center screen, and you can adjust the strength parameters of your wings, which is really, really good. If you think the wings are falling off too much, you can adjust them upwards and get, say, what is in your mind more realistic. But I think it's all a matter of taste. These are all stock parameters, and you saw that I was able to belly flop this thing through the atmosphere at several times the speed of sound. But if that's too much for you, you can also try NEAR, which is the alternative aerodynamic model by the same developer. It also misses things like, Mach effects and things like that as well. Anyway, now the aircraft is back home, it's time for the rocket team to launch the final part of the interplanetary spacecraft. Now, this is the lander spacecraft, and this is not the original design that I was planning on sending to other planets. But I really decided that I wanted something that was able to lift off from either Eve or from Tylo, and so this is what I have. It's a very, very heavy lander, but it is powered by antimatter. It has parachutes, it has control surfaces, so it's able to control itself in atmospheres. And that in part explains the kind of strange rocket design that I have for flying this thing. Yes, it was actually in theory capable of lifting off from Kerbal under its own power. It should be. However, that uses precious antimatter, of which I don't really have enough. I have maybe 1.5 grams stored up. And that is going to be enough for a single liftoff, and I'm going to harvest a little more while in flight. But this launch is entirely conventional. And now it's time to ditch the boosters in the upper atmosphere, travelling at about 1.9 kilometers per second. Ooh, always nice to watch those things get pulled away. In this case, Ferrum Aerospace is really doing a cool thing to make those things kind of fly. Pretty cool, huh? Anyway, this next stage has little rockets that are radially attached, and they will pull the rest of the spacecraft into orbit, where we can in fact rendezvous with the interplanetary spacecraft, which I guess I will be needing names for at some point. I'll probably start asking you guys for names, huh? Anyway, throttling up those engines. We actually have relatively low thrust to weight ratio in this, but we've already got most of the way actually into orbit. We're just going to continue to circularize our orbit and rendezvous. Of course, that will happen in the next episode. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.